I'll make a couple of general comments about equity before going on to try and undermine the myth that the government's portraying that this budget achieves a significant rebalancing of the economy. First, though, I think that it is important to put on record that this budget should be valued according to how much you value your word. There are three broken promises from this budget. One promise made by the Prime Minister on behalf of the National Party before the election was that they wouldn't increase GST. That promise was broken. Second was that they wouldn't borrow for tax cuts. This budget increases New Zealand's government debt so as to fund tax cuts. It's not a mere tax switch as the government pretends. They are borrowing, increasing government borrowing to fund tax cuts. That's another broken promise because they promised they wouldn't do that. And the third one is that they promised that they made before the election was that they would roll out more free early childhood education, and in actual fact this budget cuts provision for quality early childhood education, which imposes a future cost on parents whose children are currently receiving that free early childhood education. So if you value your word, you would not value this budget because those three promises are broken. Other speakers have spoken about how some of the benefits that are spoken of in terms of income tax cuts are largely dissipated through the effects of inflation and the increase to GST, and that's true, except of course for the highest income earners. We know that a full one-third of the tax cuts to income tax accrue to the top 5% of income earners. I think that bears repeating because it's easy to say quickly, but doesn't bear scrutiny, because it does seem unfair that of the income tax cuts, a full third of the total value of those income tax goes to the top 5% of income earners. That is disproportionate and shows that really the overall effect of this budget is what you always see from National. The proportion of taxes that are paid by low and middle income people goes up, and the proportion of total taxation paid by highest income earners goes down. And stripped bare, that's what the budget does. I want to turn to the issue as to whether this is fiscally responsible, and then I'm going to deal with the issue as to whether it rebalances the economy. David Cunliffe noted earlier that the government borrows more than $1 billion extra as a consequence of the tax cuts in this budget. That's correct, and indeed in the first year I think it's the extra borrowings by the government to something like $450 million. $450 million. Is that prudent at a time like this? Well, I think it is not yet clear that the world is clear of the serious problems following the world financial crisis. New Zealand is better placed than most countries because the prior government, notwithstanding the protestations of John Key when he was finance spokesperson on opposition, followed up by Bill English saying exactly the same things. Every time we ran a budget surplus, they said we ought not to have been running surpluses in those times, but we ought to have been giving tax cuts. If we had done that, then New Zealand would be closer to the position of those European countries that have such high levels of government debt at the moment that are causing problems, not just in countries like Greece, but also Spain, Ireland, Portugal, Great Britain, Japan and the USA, where there are high levels of government debt that are constraining government action. The risk of this so-called double dip is being highlighted again by economists as a consequence of the problems that we're presently seeing in Europe, where they have some serious problems with sovereign debt. They have some serious problems that go to the stability of the Eurozone generally, and there are many pundits now predicting that the Eurozone will break up because of the strictures that are being imposed on the Latin countries by Germany in particular, and by the imbalances that have been allowed to build up in Europe, whereby massive trade surpluses in a country like Germany, trade deficits in countries like Greece, so that they have current account deficits as well as government deficits. So the prospect of the so-called double dip, of a second whammy, if you like, besetting the world is real. It won't necessarily happen, but the risk is substantial. I've seen in the last week reports that China, which has been holding up demand in Australia and therefore in this part of the world, has had a 90% decrease in the volume of property transactions in Beijing. A 90% decrease in the volume of transactions suggests that their property bubble is coming or has come to an end, and that could have some pretty big implications in this part of the world. Now, why that is significant is that there are some assumptions made in the budget as to future tax revenue on the part of the government which are brave. They are very brave and they may not come to pass. And I think Burl in their budget commentary have put this well. They say that New Zealand's largest single vulnerability is now its large and growing net external liabilities. New Zealand now owes the world $168 billion, or around 90% of GDP. And then they say, and good on them for acknowledging that that's right, that the Minister of Finance acknowledges this as being the biggest risk to New Zealand at the moment. But then they go on to say that having identified this as, quotes, the largest single vulnerability, and those are the words used by the Minister of Finance in his budget speech, having identified that, it acknowledges that that vulnerability is going to get worse over the next few years because, of course, we have not only a budget deficit on the part of the government spending more than it collects in tax, but we have the country spending more than it earns in the world, with the current account deficit going up to 7% of GDP by 2014. Now that points to a couple of things. It points to the fact that the so-called rebalancing of the New Zealand economy that the government talks about as baloney. This budget does not rebalance the economy. What it does is rebalance taxes so that more are being paid by the lower paid and the middle paid, and less being paid by the higher paid. It rebaxes only taxes. It does not rebalance the economy. The effects of this in terms of New Zealand's overall net asset position in the world is that by 2014, the Treasury predicts that New Zealand's net assets in the world will be negative 100% of GDP. That's an enormous figure. 100% of GDP will be our net debt in the world. That should be worrying to New Zealanders because it is not sustainable. It is not sustainable. The other point they make is that if this was a so-called rebalancing of the economy, and we're not going to... I'll go back a step. To have that current account deficit going forward in the future to 7% means that we're not saving enough, so we're not rebalancing the economy towards savings in this budget. Contrast that with Australia. Big difference between New Zealand and Australian economies is their savings and therefore their investment capital available. It's no surprise that with their better savings record, they own our banks. We don't own our own. We export not just the interest that we pay on our current account deficit, but we export the profits of those 4 big banks to Australia every year because they own our banks. We don't, because we don't save enough. The economy is not rebalanced to address that. In addition to that, the Burl analysis notes that if it's not the net external sector that's rebalancing and causing growth in the economy, where's it coming from? Where is the government going to see the growth in the economy driving a growth in revenues to get the government deficit back to neutral? And they note that the Treasury forecast assumes a rebound in non-residential private investment, and they note that the forecast is that this business investment is going to grow, according to forecast, 6.2% in the current year, followed by 10% in the following year, 4.7%, and then 3% in the following years. And they note that that's a hugely optimistic forecast, given that at the moment businesses have cash flow problems. They're having difficulty accessing credit for expansion, even if they're not having cash flow problems. If they need to borrow some money from banks, they're having difficulty accessing credit for expansion. So they conclude by saying in the Burl summary, yes, an investment rebound of this magnitude would be welcome news indeed. We're just unsure as to how confident we are of it occurring, but it is the basis upon which the government revenue forecasts and hence the affordability of the tax cuts rests. And that, I think, is a good summary. So if it doesn't come to pass as the government has predicted, where is the government left? Well, it's left the country with rising government debt, and it will only have 3 choices. It will either have to cut spending, cut services, It will have to increase taxes or it'll have to flog off capital assets. And the government already knows they've got us in that position because they're signalling flogging off capital assets, the silver that is being accumulated through years of prudent management by prior governments, KiwiSaver, electricity